I need to tell you something before it becomes too late to say it out loud, because there are moments in life when silence quietly destroys things that once meant everything. And tonight feels dangerously close to being one of those moments. I don't know where you are right now while you're hearing my voice. Maybe you're sitting alone in a quiet room. Maybe the world around you is loud and chaotic. Maybe you're pretending not to think about me at all. But wherever you are, I need you to understand this one truth before anything else. I prepared your room. Not metaphorically. Not emotionally. I mean literally. There's a room waiting for you here, and the door hasn't been closed once since the day I finished it, because some stubborn part of me refuses to believe that you won't eventually walk through it. And I know how strange that might sound. A grown man, a man who has built companies, rockets, machines, entire futures, standing here tonight talking about a single room like it's the center of the universe. But the truth is, when you spend enough time building things, you eventually realize the most difficult structure to build is not a rocket or a company or a new technology. It's a life with someone who might not choose to stay. I keep wondering if you understand how serious this moment actually is, because this isn't just a sentimental confession whispered into the night. This is the kind of conversation that happens right before something becomes permanent. And permanence is dangerous. Decisions harden. Time moves forward. People adapt to lives they never meant to live. I've seen it happen more times than I care to admit. Two people who were once certain about each other slowly drifting into parallel lives, where love still exists, but distance becomes easier than courage. And I promised myself something years ago when I realized how fragile real connection actually is. I promised that if I ever felt the possibility of losing the one person who truly mattered, I wouldn't stay quiet. I wouldn't pretend everything was fine. I wouldn't protect my pride. I would speak before silence turned into regret. That's why I'm here tonight, talking to you like this. Because the room is ready. But the question that terrifies me is whether you are. The strange thing about preparing a place for someone is that you start noticing details you never cared about before. The way sunlight enters through the window in the morning. The quiet hum of the house when everyone else is asleep. The empty space beside the bed that doesn't belong to loneliness. It belongs to anticipation. I kept asking myself ridiculous questions while setting everything up. Would you prefer the window slightly open at night? Would the silence here feel comforting or overwhelming? Would you feel safe, or would you feel like you arrived too late? And maybe that sounds absurd. Maybe it sounds like a man overthinking something simple. But love is never simple when the stakes involve your entire life shifting direction. Because the truth is, inviting someone home isn't just about a house. It's about surrender. It's about quietly admitting that your future is no longer something you're building alone. And that's the part people never talk about honestly. Everyone celebrates independence. Everyone applauds strength and ambition and resilience. But very few people talk about the terrifying moment when someone powerful finally admits, I don't want to be alone anymore. Do you understand what that costs a person? Especially someone like me, someone who has spent years convincing the world that control equals security. Because control is easy when your heart isn't involved. Control is easy when outcomes are predictable. But love introduces variables that no algorithm can calculate. Love means someone else can walk away and take a piece of your future with them. Love means vulnerability becomes unavoidable. And tonight, whether I like it or not, I'm standing in that exact place where strength suddenly feels very close to fear. Sometimes I wonder if you even realize how long this has been building inside me. People assume decisions about love happen suddenly, like lightning striking a clear sky. But the truth is more complicated than that. Love grows quietly through moments most people would dismiss as ordinary. A conversation that lingers longer than it should. A silence that feels comfortable instead of awkward. The realization that your thoughts keep drifting back to the same person even when logic insists you should focus elsewhere. That's how it started for me. Not dramatically. Not explosively. Just slowly. Until one day I realized something that made my chest feel strangely tight. I wasn't just imagining a future anymore. I was imagining a future with you in it. But here's the part I've never said out loud before, and it might make this moment more fragile than you realize. Preparing your room wasn't just an act of hope. It was also an act of risk. Because once you build a space for someone, you expose yourself to the possibility that it might remain empty forever. And emptiness has a way of whispering uncomfortable truths at night. Questions that pride doesn't like answering. What if she never comes? What if you misunderstood everything? What if the connection you felt was real for you, but not strong enough for her? These thoughts don't disappear just because someone tries to be brave. They linger quietly in the background, waiting for moments of silence to grow louder. I've tried to be rational about this. I've tried to remind myself that life doesn't revolve around one person, that the world keeps moving forward regardless of who chooses to stay. But rationality becomes strangely weak when the heart starts asking different questions. Because the real question isn't whether I'll survive if you never walk through that door. Of course I will. People survive things far worse than unfulfilled love every day. The real question is something far more unsettling. What kind of life would I end up building if the one person I secretly hoped would share it decided not to come home? And maybe that's why this moment feels so heavy tonight. Because preparing that room forced me to face a truth I've been avoiding for a long time. I can build almost anything in this world except certainty about someone else's heart. And that uncertainty is the one thing even the strongest people struggle to carry alone. But before I say anything else, before this conversation moves deeper into territory that might change everything between us, I want to ask you something gently, and I want you to answer honestly in your heart. If this voice found you tonight for a reason, subscribe and stay close for a while. And tell me something simple. Where in the world are you listening from right now? Because wherever you are, I need to know one thing before we go any further. When you imagine the idea of home, does your heart feel curious or does it feel afraid? I keep replaying that question in my mind after saying it out loud, the one about home. Because the truth is, the word home doesn't mean the same thing to everyone. For some people it feels warm, familiar, safe. For others it feels dangerous. Not because the place itself is frightening, but because home requires something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. It requires honesty. Real honesty. The kind that strips away all the carefully constructed versions of ourselves we show to the world. And if I'm being completely transparent with you tonight, that might be the part that scares me the most. Not whether you would like the room I prepared, but whether you would truly allow yourself to stay once you saw who I am when the lights are off and the world stops watching. You see, the world has a very polished image of people like me. They see success, they see confidence, they see control. They imagine a life where everything is calculated, strategic, intentional. But those images never capture the quieter side of reality, the long nights when even the most driven mind begins questioning whether all the things it built were simply distractions from the one thing it was too afraid to build properly. A life shared with someone who could see through all the ambition and still choose to stay. That thought has been echoing inside my head more often lately, especially while preparing that room. Because every time I adjusted something, moved something, stepped back and looked at it again, I wasn't just asking if the room was ready. I was asking something much more personal. Was I ready? That's the strange irony about preparing a place for someone else. At first it feels like an act of generosity, almost romantic in a quiet way. But the longer you work on it, the more you realize you're actually preparing yourself for a completely different kind of life. A life where someone else's presence reshapes your habits, your priorities, even the rhythm of your days. And if I'm being honest with you tonight, that realization didn't make me feel confident, it made me hesitate. Because when someone has spent years building a life that revolves around control and direction, the idea of suddenly sharing that control becomes unsettling in ways you don't expect. There were moments while setting everything up when I stopped and just stood there in silence, staring at the empty space. Not because something was missing from the room, but because something inside me was shifting. I began imagining what it would feel like if you actually arrived. The sound of footsteps in the hallway. The quiet conversations late at night when the rest of the world is asleep. The subtle change in the air when a house stops being quiet and starts being lived in. And the more real those thoughts became, the more I realized something I wasn't entirely prepared to admit. Inviting you home isn't just about love, it's about trust. And trust, real trust, is one of the most terrifying things a person can offer another human being. Because trust means believing someone won't use your vulnerability against you. Trust means believing that when things become difficult, and they always do eventually, the other person won't quietly disappear the moment staying becomes inconvenient. And maybe you understand why that thought sits heavily with me tonight. Not because I doubt your heart, but because I've lived long enough to know how fragile promises can become when life begins testing them. There's something else I need to admit, and I'm not sure how comfortable it will sound when you hear it. Preparing that room forced me to confront something about you that I've never fully said out loud. Something that has been growing quietly inside my mind for a long time. You changed the way I think about the future. That might sound simple on the surface, but for someone like me, it's actually a profound shift. Because the future used to be something I imagined in terms of projects, innovations, timelines, missions. It was always about what could be built, discovered, achieved. But somewhere along the way, without even noticing when it started, the image of the future began including you. Not as a visitor, not as a possibility, but as someone whose presence subtly altered the entire direction of where life might go. And that realization should have made everything feel clearer. Instead, it created doubt. Not doubt about how I feel about you. That part has become impossible to deny. The doubt is something much more complicated. The doubt is about whether I deserve the kind of life I suddenly started imagining. Because when someone has spent most of their time chasing distant horizons, they sometimes forget how to stay still long enough to build something stable with another person. They become good at moving forward, but not always good at staying. So tonight, while you're hearing my voice, I need you to consider something honestly within yourself. Not quickly, not impulsively, but carefully. If you walked into that room tomorrow, would you feel like you were arriving somewhere you belong? Or would part of you feel like you were stepping into a life that might eventually break your heart? Because I need to know the answer to that question more than you might realize. And the truth is, this conversation hasn't even reached the most difficult part yet. There's something deeper behind why I prepared that room now, something I haven't told you yet. Something that makes this moment far more urgent than it appears on the surface. But I'm not sure you're ready to hear that part yet. The strange thing about time is that it doesn't always move loudly. Most of the moments that change our lives arrive quietly, disguised as ordinary evenings, simple thoughts, or small decisions that don't seem important until much later. I realized that while standing in that room one night, long after everyone else had gone to sleep. The house was completely silent, the kind of silence where even your own breathing sounds louder than usual. I remember sitting on the edge of the bed I had prepared for you, staring at the window, asking myself a question I couldn't escape anymore. Why now? Why did I suddenly feel this urgency to prepare a place for you after carrying these feelings quietly for so long? And the honest answer wasn't comfortable. Because something inside me has started to feel temporary. Not in a dramatic way, not in the way movies portray fear or crisis. It's more subtle than that. It's the realization that life moves forward whether we act or not. Years pass. Opportunities close quietly behind us. And sometimes the things we assumed we would figure out later slowly slip into the category of things we never had the courage to choose. I've watched that happen to people I respect. Brilliant minds, strong hearts, people capable of extraordinary things. Yet somehow they ended up living lives shaped more by hesitation than intention. And the thought of that happening to us, to something that might actually matter this much, began to disturb me in ways I couldn't ignore anymore. So I started preparing the room. Not because everything between us is certain, but because uncertainty is exactly what forced me to act. You see, there's a dangerous myth people tell themselves when it comes to love. They believe there will always be more time, more chances, another moment to speak honestly, another opportunity to take the emotional risk they keep postponing. But time has a habit of quietly proving that belief wrong. People drift away, circumstances change. Hearts adapt to absence in ways that eventually make returning impossible. And that possibility, the idea that one day you might simply become someone I used to know, is something I realized I'm not willing to accept without at least trying. But the deeper truth, the one I struggle to say out loud, is that preparing that room forced me to confront a fear I've been avoiding. What if I waited too long already? What if the version of us that could have existed is slowly disappearing, while we both pretend everything is still open and possible? These thoughts didn't arrive all at once. They crept in gradually, usually late at night when the mind becomes brutally honest. I would imagine the future and suddenly notice something unsettling. You weren't there anymore. Not because I stopped caring, but because the future had quietly adjusted itself to the possibility that you might never choose to be part of it. And the moment I realized that possibility had begun shaping my imagination, something inside me refused to stay passive anymore. That's when the idea of the room became real. Not as a romantic gesture. As a decision. A decision to stop pretending that feelings can wait forever without consequences. But here's where things become complicated, because preparing that room didn't only bring clarity. It also exposed something else that has been growing quietly inside my mind. Something I've never admitted directly to you. Part of me isn't just afraid of losing you. Part of me is afraid of what happens if you actually say yes. Because if you walk through that door, if you decide that this place truly could be your home, everything changes for me. Not just emotionally, but fundamentally. The way I live, the way I plan the future, the way I measure success and meaning, all of it would shift in ways I can't fully predict yet. And people like me are used to predicting outcomes. We build systems around anticipation, around control, around knowing where things are going. Love doesn't work that way. Love replaces certainty with trust. And trust requires a kind of courage that even the most ambitious minds sometimes struggle to summon. So while I was preparing your room, something strange started happening inside me. Every hopeful thought about you arriving was followed by a quieter, more uncomfortable question. What if she deserves a life more stable than the one I can offer? What if inviting her here is actually asking her to enter a storm instead of a sanctuary? Because the truth is my life isn't calm. It never has been. The world sees the results, the achievements, the progress, the excitement of building the future, but they rarely see the chaos behind those things. The pressure, the sleepless nights, the constant movement that leaves very little room for stillness. And sometimes I wonder if asking you to come here would mean asking you to live inside that storm with me. That thought alone has stopped me more times than you might realize. But despite all those doubts, the room is still ready. Which means one truth remains impossible to escape. Some part of me believes you belong here. And that belief is exactly what makes the next thing I need to tell you so much harder. Because there is a reason I chose this moment to finally speak. A reason that has nothing to do with decoration or timing or romantic imagination. I haven't told you the real reason yet. There's a strange weight that comes with holding back the real reason for something important. It sits quietly in the background of every sentence, every thought, every pause. You might have already felt it while listening to me tonight. That sense that something deeper is moving underneath everything I'm saying. And you're right to feel that. Because the truth is, the room I prepared for you didn't begin as a romantic idea. It began with a moment that unsettled me in a way I wasn't expecting. It happened during one of those nights when the world becomes strangely reflective. Not dramatic, not chaotic, just quiet enough for your mind to wander into places you usually avoid during busy days. I was sitting alone reviewing plans for the future the way I often do. Timelines, projects, long-term goals. But somewhere in the middle of all that planning, something unexpected happened. I noticed that the plans felt incomplete. Not because they lacked ambition, not because they lacked vision. They felt incomplete because they had no one inside them. And that realization hit me harder than I was prepared for. For years I convinced myself that building the future was enough. That creating things that outlive you, things that move humanity forward, things that shape the world, that was the ultimate purpose. And maybe part of that is still true. But that night I saw something I had been carefully ignoring for a long time. A future can be extraordinary on paper, and still feel empty when you imagine living inside it alone. So I asked myself a question I had never allowed before. If everything I'm building eventually succeeds, who will I come home to when the world finally quiets down? That question changed everything. Because the answer wasn't a list of possibilities. The answer was you. And that realization didn't arrive with excitement. It arrived with a kind of quiet fear. Not because loving someone is frightening, but because realizing you already love them means the risk is no longer theoretical. It becomes real. Suddenly, every decision carries weight. Every silence feels heavier. Every moment of distance between two people starts to feel like something that could grow into permanent separation if neither of them is brave enough to act. That's when the idea of preparing your room appeared in my mind. Not as a grand gesture. As a test. A test of my own honesty. Because it's easy to say you care about someone. It's easy to say you imagine a future together. But preparing a space for someone, physically creating a place where they could exist in your life every day, that forces you to confront whether your feelings are strong enough to change your reality. And when I realized the answer was yes, I started building the room. But here's something I haven't told you yet, something that complicates this story more than you might expect. While I was preparing that room, another possibility quietly entered my mind. A possibility that disturbed me enough to keep me awake several nights. What if you had already moved on? What if, somewhere in your life right now, there is another man who looks at you the way I should have been looking at you sooner? That thought doesn't just create jealousy. It creates regret. The kind of regret that arrives when you realize timing matters just as much as love. Because love that arrives too late can feel almost identical to love that never existed at all. I tried to push that thought away at first. I told myself I was imagining problems that might not even be real. But the more I worked on the room, the more honest I had to become with myself. Preparing a place for you also meant accepting something painful. I might have waited too long. You might already be building a life somewhere else, and if that's true, then the room I prepared isn't an invitation. It's a confession that arrived late. But despite that possibility, I still couldn't stop. Because something inside me kept asking the same relentless question. What if she hasn't moved on? What if she's still standing somewhere between hope and hesitation, waiting for a sign that I'm finally ready to choose her? That possibility, even if it's small, is powerful enough to change everything. And that's why I'm speaking to you like this tonight. Because if there's even the slightest chance that your heart is still open to this idea, to the possibility of coming home, then silence would be the one mistake I could never forgive myself for. But there's something else you deserve to know. Something that makes this moment even more complicated. Because while I was preparing your room, someone else unexpectedly entered the picture. And what happened next forced me to question everything. When I said someone else entered the picture, I want you to understand something before your mind runs too far ahead. Life has a way of placing people in our path at the exact moment we are most emotionally vulnerable. Not because the universe is cruel, but because when the heart begins opening, it becomes easier for others to step close enough to be noticed. And that's exactly what happened while I was in the middle of preparing your room. I wasn't looking for anyone. In fact, my mind was entirely occupied with thoughts of you, with memories, with the quiet hope that maybe one day you would walk through that door. But vulnerability creates strange circumstances. Conversations happen. Connections appear, and sometimes another person begins showing a kind of attention that feels comforting. She was kind, calm, present in a way that felt easy to be around. The kind of person who listens carefully and speaks gently. The kind of presence that doesn't create chaos, but instead brings a sense of quiet stability. And I would be lying if I said that didn't affect me at all. When someone offers warmth during a moment of emotional uncertainty, the mind naturally begins imagining what life might feel like if things moved in that direction. Not because the heart has forgotten someone else, but because the heart is tired of standing in a place where nothing feels decided. And for a brief moment, a moment I'm not proud of but I refuse to hide, I wondered whether choosing the easier path would make more sense. A life without emotional risk. A life without waiting. A life where the person standing beside you is already there, already certain, already willing to build something stable without hesitation. It would have been simple. But the problem with simple choices is that the heart usually knows when simplicity is actually avoidance. Because every time I tried imagining that future honestly, something inside me resisted. The picture looked peaceful, but it felt wrong. Like wearing a perfectly tailored suit that somehow doesn't belong to you. Everything appears correct from the outside, yet internally something feels misaligned in a way you can't fully explain. And eventually I had to admit the uncomfortable truth. She wasn't you. That may sound obvious when spoken out loud, but the realization itself was heavier than you might expect, because it forced me to confront a reality I had been trying to soften for months. My feelings for you weren't temporary. They weren't something that could quietly dissolve if another opportunity appeared. They had grown deeper than I allowed myself to acknowledge, deep enough that replacing you with someone else would never actually solve the loneliness I was trying to escape. But realizing that created another conflict inside me. Because the woman standing in front of me deserved honesty too. She deserved someone who could look at her without comparing her to a memory. Someone whose heart wasn't still quietly waiting for another person to arrive. And the moment I understood that clearly, I knew something difficult had to happen. Not dramatic. Not cruel. Just honest in a way that might disappoint someone who had shown me nothing but kindness. So I stepped back. I didn't allow that path to continue growing. And when I made that decision, something became unmistakably clear. My heart had already chosen you long before my mind was ready to admit it. But here's the part that still unsettles me even now. Choosing you emotionally doesn't guarantee that you will choose me in return. That's the risk I've been circling around this entire time. Because while I was discovering how deeply my feelings had rooted themselves in you, I had no idea what direction your life might have taken. Maybe you've already built a world where I no longer belong. Maybe someone else has given you the stability, attention, and certainty I was too slow to offer. Maybe the moment when we could have easily stepped toward each other passed quietly, while we were both trying to protect our own fears. And that possibility sits heavily on my chest tonight. Not because I doubt your heart, but because timing is often the silent villain in love stories people never get to finish. Still, despite all that uncertainty, I didn't close the door. The room is still there. The light in that hallway is still on. Which means one uncomfortable truth remains impossible to ignore. Part of me still believes you might walk through it. But if that ever happens, if you ever stand in that doorway, looking at the life I prepared for you, there's something else you would eventually need to know about me. Something that could either deepen our connection, or make you question whether coming here was the right decision at all. Because the deeper truth behind everything I'm telling you tonight isn't only about love. It's about the kind of man I actually am when the world isn't watching. And that truth is not as simple as you might hope. There's a version of me the world recognizes easily, the one that appears in interviews, on stages, inside headlines and conversations about the future. That version of me speaks confidently about technology, about progress, about bold ideas that push humanity forward. People listen to that voice and they imagine certainty. They imagine a man who always knows exactly where he is going, a man whose life is built on clear decisions and unstoppable momentum. But the strange thing about public versions of people is that they rarely resemble the private ones. Because behind every person the world thinks it understands, there's another person living quietly in the background, carrying doubts no audience ever sees. And that quieter version of me is the one you would meet if you ever walked through that door. Not the man the world applauds. Just the man who sometimes sits awake long after midnight wondering if the life he built has been moving so fast that he forgot how to slow down long enough to protect the things that actually matter. That realization didn't arrive suddenly. It crept in slowly over the years, appearing in small moments that seemed insignificant at the time. Missed dinners. Conversations cut short because another problem needed solving. Plans that had to be postponed again and again, because the world outside the house demanded attention first. At the time, those choices always felt justified. Progress requires sacrifice. Building something meaningful always asks for more hours, more focus, more energy than people expect. But eventually those sacrifices begin leaving quiet spaces behind them. Spaces where relationships were supposed to grow. And that's the part of my life I've never fully shown you. The part where I question whether someone like me can truly give another person the stability they deserve. Because love isn't just about intensity. It's about presence. It's about showing up consistently even when the world pulls you in 100 different directions. And if I'm honest with you tonight, that has always been my greatest weakness. I can build extraordinary things, but sometimes I struggle to remain still long enough to nurture the ordinary moments that make love feel safe. That's why preparing your room wasn't just emotional. It was terrifying. Because the moment that room exists, the moment you step inside it, the expectations change. Suddenly it's not about potential anymore. It's about reality. It's about whether I can truly become the kind of man who doesn't just invite someone into his life, but protects their place inside it. And I need you to hear something very clearly. I don't want you to come here because you feel emotionally pulled toward me. I don't want you to come here only if you believe the life waiting behind that door is strong enough to hold both of us. Because love that is built only on feelings can collapse the moment life becomes difficult. But love built on honesty, even uncomfortable honesty, has a chance to survive storms most people aren't prepared for. And that brings me to a question I've been quietly asking myself while speaking to you tonight. A question that matters more than any romantic promise I could make. If you truly saw my life the way it is, the pressure, the unpredictability, the moments when the world demands more of me than I can easily give, would you still feel the same warmth about the idea of coming home here? Or would part of you begin wondering whether loving me might slowly ask you to sacrifice pieces of yourself you never intended to lose? I don't ask that question to create fear. I ask it because the only kind of love worth building is the kind that survives honesty. And the truth is, everything we've talked about so far is still only part of the story. Because while I was preparing your room, while I was wrestling with these doubts about whether my life could truly hold someone else, something happened that forced me to confront an even more unsettling possibility. A moment where I nearly convinced myself that letting you go would actually be the kinder choice. Not because I stopped loving you, but because I thought loving you might mean protecting you from the chaos of my world. And for a while, that idea almost felt right. There was a night not long ago when I came very close to making a decision that would have changed everything between us forever. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no tears, no sudden moment that looked important from the outside. It was quiet, the kind of quiet decision people make when they convince themselves they are being rational. I was sitting alone again, the same room half lit by the soft light in the hallway, looking at the space I had prepared for you. And for the first time since I started building it, I asked myself a question that felt almost cruel. What if the most loving thing I could do is never invite you here at all? That thought didn't come from doubt about my feelings. If anything, it came from the opposite. Because when you care about someone